Hello, this is Eric. Today is March the 9th, 2023, and in this video, we will address the Vargas era. Yes, it is definitely a turning point in the history of Brazil, and due to the long period in which Getúlio Vargas remained in power, we call it the Vargas era, okay? Well, it is very important that you understand all the details, and since by this time we already have more resources in terms of technology to check all the events that took place during this period, I will show you a video regarding the 1932 revolution, which is one of the events, one of the most important events that occurred during the Vargas era. Okay, so well, this is then Getúlio Vargas, right? One of his many pictures, and it is very important that you notice that Getúlio Vargas remained in power for 15 consecutive years, and then he will return again years later as president, right? But in this case, I mean, in his second period as president, in his second term, we will have a specific class, a specific video for that mandate, for that term, okay? Well, you probably watched our last class, right, regarding the crisis of the oligarchic republic. If you haven't watched it, please close this video right now and watch our last video on the crisis of the oligarchic republic, right? Well, the oligarchic republic ended with Washington Luiz, with President Washington Luiz, right? And really, we had the lieutenantism as a really important partner of Getúlio Vargas in this moment, right? Because, Getúlio Vargas joined forces with the people that was tired of the oligarchic republic, and also with the lieutenants that supported him in the military sphere, right? So, well, Getúlio Vargas then becomes president, right? And we have his provisional government, okay? The 1891 Constitution is simply nulled, right? It becomes null. And we have also the closure of the legislative power at all levels, right? In place of the governors, federal interveners are put in power, right? They are appointed by Vargas with full powers, both in the executive and legislative sphere, right? And it's basically the end of state autonomy, right? Well, so here we have a clear centralization of power, right? However, Getúlio Vargas, kept affirming that was provisional, right? As the name itself says, provisional government, right? And that a new constitution would be drawn up, right? And that in the right timing, new elections would be held. And so, basically, with the coming of Getúlio Vargas to the power and the end of the oligarchic republic, we have the end of the leadership that São Paulo, the state of São Paulo, and also Minas Gerais, we have the end of this leadership that both these two states exercise it on the country, right? Well, Getúlio Vargas made use of populism, right? He was a very charismatic leader, right? He made use of demagogy. What is demagogy? Demagogy is basically, the politics used to manipulate the masses, right, with stuff that they consider as being important for them, and it walks basically hand in hand with populism, right? We had this strong nationalism feeling, right? Getúlio really was a master in this sense. We are going to be seeing, this natural talent that he had in the sense, to drive the masses, right, and to make them the masses believe that he was really the best option, and that he was doing nothing but everything that was good for the people, right? Well, but actually, we have the control of trade unions by the state through subservience, right? We have also the labor laws. Yes, because Brazil had brought many immigrants, right, to the country. We had many and many immigrants here, and they came with everything that they learned and lived in Europe, right? And in Europe, we had the proletariat. We have basically communism going on. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Europe, and these immigrants, they bring this package with them, right? And so Getúlio Vargas is not indifferent, towards these immigrants, towards this proletariat, right? And he really works hard on the labor laws, right? He establishes a Ministry of Labor, of Industry and Trade. He basically establishes the Labor Nationalization Act. He regulates women's and night labor, and he establishes the unionization law, right? So it's a lot of stuff, even for a provisional government, and I would say much more, by the way, for a provisional government, right? Well, anyway, that's what happened in this period. And also, we had this state-controlled trade unions. So these trade unions, they would be monitored, they would be closely monitored by the government, and they would basically work based on subservience, right? So they would basically be liable, subject to the government in every way. Getúlio Vargas also established the work card. Here you have his own work card, right? It says professional card up there in Portuguese, and his picture and signature. I have my own as well. Well, and he established the 8-hour day workload. I think, I should correct it here, but anyway, work day or workload, as you wish, okay? And lastly, he established the right to paid weekly holidays and rest. So that's a whole lot of stuff, right? And in doing so, he satisfied, the labor classes, the proletariat, right? However, time was passing by, right? And really, the people of São Paulo began to feel that the provisional government that should be provisional was taking too long. And they began to doubt Getúlio Vargas, and they were also not satisfied for the fact that they no longer had, the leadership in the country recognized, right? So I'm going to show you a video right now. As I said, we have, by this time, we already have enough technology to show us in detail, maybe not in colors, but anyway, in details, what was going on at the time. And in this video, you're going to see opinions of very recognized and important historians, right? And, well, it's all in Portuguese, but I produce a voiceover in this case, right? I voiced over this video so that you can see the images and not have to, to keep reading the subtitles all the time. So I hope you enjoy it. And after the video, we will continue with our content, right? So basically, just for you to understand, more and more São Paulo was becoming dissatisfied, right, with Getúlio Vargas. You will understand through the video the reasons for that. And this dissatisfaction ended up becoming a revolution, actually a civil war in which the state of São Paulo fought against the other states of Brazil. And that was a really hard battle, right? A hard civil war in the country. And, well, you will now understand all the details, how it began and how it ended, okay? Well, let's watch it then. With the victory of the 1930 revolution, the Democratic Party believed that its time to go from opposition to situation had come. But the revolution leaders did not trust the Democrats from São Paulo. In the eyes of the lieutenants, the São Paulo politicians were all the same. And deep inside, they only thought of one thing: conquering state and federal power. To prevent this from happening, the lieutenants claimed a palace in Campos Elíseos, headquarters of the government of São Paulo, and were assisted by the provisional government. The intervener would neither be civil nor from São Paulo, but military and from Pernambuco. The appointed one was Colonel João Alberto. Here he is at the Miguel Costa column. The public force command of São Paulo was delivered to Miguel Costa, and it had the political sustainment of a paramilitary force, the Revolutionary Legion. For lieutenants, democracy is a social democracy. It meant giving power to new groups and revitalizing, so to say, classes and groups that had never been heard, so as to neutralize those old oligarchies. So democracy had to be anti-oligarchic. For the São Paulo groups, democracy was the formal democracy, a legal democracy, and it had nothing to do with social democracy. João Alberto governed for only 40 days. In this period, he took measures that made the dominating classes frightened. He increased salaries in 5%, established a guarantee of a minimum of 40 hours per week of work, and allowed a section of the Communist Party to be installed in São Paulo. What one would most hear all the time was that the lieutenants had exchanged their old ideology for one of social reforms that were leaning towards communism. And so the São Paulo entrepreneurs suffered as well the most harsh effects of depression, of the international depression. From 1928 to 1930, the Brazilian exports went from 96 million to 65 millions of pounds. When Vargas became president, 30 millions of coffee sacks with no buyers were going rot in the warehouses. As the revolution intended to limit the power of the coffee owners, but not the power of the main export coffee, a São Paulo civilian was appointed for the presidency of Banco do Brasil, the Brazil Bank. For some time, the coffee prices were artificially sustained by the provisional government, and not only through subsidies. To diminish the stock, the government burned tons of coffee. But not even so, prices went up. However, the political temperature kept going up. On April 28, 1931, the 6th Infantry Battalion of the Public Force went up to Cambuci in the São Paulo capital with the participation of the members of the Democratic Party. That resulted in nothing, but it was also the first sign that São Paulo civilians were willing to do anything to get rid of the lieutenants. It became very clear that the lieutenants would not be defeated without fighting. So it was this idea that the possibilities for negotiating were extinguished that actually led to the constitutionalization that was quick in the country and to São Paulo autonomy. What fundamentally awakens this medium-class mass that goes to the streets in 1932 is the idea that São Paulo was hurt and that it was carrying the other states in the federation. That São Paulo was occupied by a lieutenant that had no talent, and all of that explains the sensation of deep injustice and deep duty in the name of Brazil to reveal things. Without this feeling and this kind of value, one cannot explain the mobilization that took place there. Though Southern and Minas Gerais civilians were also disappointed with the results of the 1930 revolution, it was the São Paulo civilians that agitated everything against the provisional government. None of the three successors of João Alberto managed to make things go well. Getúlio chose as intervener the São Paulo civilian Camargo that did not have the support of the São Paulo politicians and had to resign only 3 months after assuming the power. In his place, Manuel Rebelo also stayed in power for a little time. These respectable gentlemen are politicians, public employees, and journalists from São Paulo united to complete the enlargement of the São João Street, which would give room for the São João Avenue. After the urban reform in the city of São Paulo civilians would join forces to try to reform the political system of the country. In 1932, in the month of January, the Democratic Party breaks relations with the provisional government and joins forces with the Republican Party. This is the São Paulo Soul Front. The pact between the two parties is sealed with a gigantic meeting in the Sirius Square. Then we have this occasion in which it poured with rain and one saw the greatest political manifestation ever. The word of order was everything for São Paulo, and one of the speechers yelled, "The lieutenants are Getúlio's eunuchs." Responding to that, the Jornal Diário Carioca sympathizes with the constitutionalist ideals in Rio, which was the main reduct of the lieutenants. Shocked with that, the Southern civilians and politicians, Lindolfo Collor, Luzardo João da Neves da Fontoura, and Mariana Cardoso, resigned and went back to Pampas to conspire. The option for an armed revolt in opposition to the liberal strategy is explained by the fact that the liberals, both from the government, the southern ministers that resigned at a certain moment, and the liberals from all other states were convinced that the provisional government was becoming eternal in power and that did not really wanted to start working on the new constitution. So they decided that the recipe for 1932 would be the same as in 1930, that is, weapons. In March 1932, Getúlio appoints a new intervener for São Paulo that agrees with the two key demands from the São Paulo Soul Front. Pedro de Toledo was civilian and from São Paulo, but had been living outside of the state for 20 years and had no direct links with the politicians in São Paulo. Here we have Pedro de Toledo visiting the High School of Arts, and him, when he was a ministry during the President Hermes da Fonseca office. Then he would live outside of Brazil as ambassador for 10 years. When appointed as intervener in São Paulo in March 1932, Pedro de Toledo formed a secretariat in which the members of the Revolutionary Legion were the majority. Miguel Costa continued ahead of the public force. And against the will of the lieutenants, the new intervener established contacts with the Soul Front of São Paulo, and by then it decided to fight if Getúlio exonerated Toledo or Berthold Kingler. In case of war, the support of Kingler would be fundamental for the São Paulo civilians. The armed format was something that did not bother the claims. 1932 belongs to this large sequence, and several of the characters that were there in 1930 will be in 1932 as well. This resorting to armed violence was characteristic of the Republican history. To weaken the alliance formed by the Soul Front in São Paulo, with military forces, Getúlio Vargas promises a constitution and elections for May of 1933, but São Paulo civilians did not trust him anymore. Actually, what the federal government was proposing was a reduction of the São Paulo representation within the reset of the national political forces, which was kind of like what happened with the military government that we're undergoing now in this political composition of the Congress. On May 22nd, 1932, the Economy Ministry of the Provisional Government, Oswaldo Aranha, arrives at São Paulo to try to establish an agreement with the Sul Front and the lieutenants. Received with rude words, Getúlio's representative failed in his mission and goes back to the Catete Palace with nothing in hand. On the same day when Oswaldo Aranha arrived in São Paulo, a rally was called on the Patriarca Square in São Paulo. A pamphlet was distributed protesting against interference in the holy right of the São Paulo people to choose their governors. In the following day, a new rally took place, and this time it was called by the students. The commerce closed its doors, and the streets of the city are taken by storm in a wave of agitations. According to a testimony, in that day, the noise that was apparently clapping that was heard was one of women shooting upwards. A multitude then goes to the Campos Elíseos site where Francisco Morato announces a new secretariat of the intervener Pedro de Toledo formed only by authentic representatives of São Paulo. Miguel Costa is put away from public force. In spite of this victory, the manifestations go on. With no police officers, the city is taken by young people. Newspapers linked to Miguel Costa and the provisional government are destroyed. Commerce selling machine guns and ammunition are taken. An armed group goes straight to the headquarters of the Revolutionary Legion in Itapetininga. The building is attacked and the legionaries respond with machine guns. In the dawn, the legionaries finally surrendered. Out of the conflict, at least 5 youngsters are dead. Among them, so these are the names: Márcio Martins, Euclides Miragaia, Drauzio de Souza, and Antonio Camargo. These are the first martyrs of the Civil War that was about to eclode. With the initial letters of their names, MMDC, a secret society is baptized, which was created to support civil fighters and the revolution, the armed revolution. May 23rd is a day when these forces ended up implementing the 1930 revolution to extinguish their internal enemy that was Legion and Miguel Costa. And on July 9th, they advanced against the external enemy, which was the dictatorship. All right. Well, I hope you have enjoyed the video, right? So, as you could see in the video, on May 23rd, we had these 4 young people that were killed, whose initial letters of their names were MMDC, right? And this acronym, or, these letters were used, to name the revolution, right? That had its onset on July 9th. And this civil war, was really brutal. More people died, around 2,000 people died in the civil war. So it's more than actually, the number of Brazilians that were killed in the Second World War. So it's a lot. So, this brutal civil war lasted 3 months. Right, the leaders were generals Bertoldo Klinger, that you saw in the video, and Isidoro Dias Lopes, that you also saw in the video, right? Well, so the factors really are, the fact that, São Paulo was dissatisfied, as I said, because they had lost their old hegemony, right, through the revolution of 1930. They were patiently waiting, but they began to suspect that the waiting, was too long, and that Getúlio Vargas had other intentions in mind, had other ideas in mind, right? So that caused all this political that was added. Sorry, you can add to that the political instability in São Paulo that had 4 interveners in 2 years. Remember, the interveners were placed, they were put in power to replace the governors, right? So what São Paulo wanted was a civil and a paulista intervener. Paulista is São Paulo's citizen, right? So they wanted a civil and paulista intervener. They wanted a constitution. Remember, keep in mind that the 1891 constitution had been abolished, right? After the revolution, the 1930 revolution, and they wanted presidential elections. Well, Getúlio Vargas had promised that in 1933 there would be new elections, right? And he also promised to work in the right timing. He promised that he would be working on a new constitution, right? So these are the advertisements at the time. Here it says Paulista, São Paulo, civilian. I have already fulfilled my duty. What about you, MMDC? You have a duty to fulfill. Consult your conscience. And here you have a duty to fulfill again. The same thing, consult your conscience, right? So these are, the advertisements calling, the Paulistas, the São Paulo civilians to participate in this civil war, in this revolution that that ended up becoming a civil war, right? Well, at the end of the Civil War, we have the military victory of the Vargas government and the political victory of São Paulo. Why? Because although São Paulo, the state of São Paulo, lost, the war, they had to surrender. What they were demanding from Getúlio Vargas really ended up becoming a reality, right? A civil and São Paulo intervener, a civil and police intervener was appointed. There was a call for elections to the Constituent Assembly in 1933, and we had a presidential election in 1934. However, Getúlio Vargas did fulfill his promise, right? The problem is that once still in the provisional government, once the Constituent Assembly was established and the deputies and all those people in charge of that came up with the new Constitution of 1934, Getúlio Vargas ended up being elected by the very legislative power to become president. So still, the people would have to wait a little more to be able to elect, their president and their politicians directly. This time, Getúlio Vargas was indirectly elected. Okay, well, but in this new constitution, for example, we have the end of the vice president position. We have the so acclaimed, so awaited secret vote. So no more opening vote, and all that corruption that we saw in the oligarchic republic. But only those who were literate and 18 years old or more could vote. Also, the women for the first time would be allowed to vote. That's quite a breakthrough, don't you think? Well, we also had the professional vote. This professional vote here was actually, vote that took place inside the trade unions, to establish those that in each field of activity in the economy would lead the country, right? Presidential term was defined for 4 years. We had the consolidation of the labor laws, right? That had already been implemented in the beginning, in the onset of the provisional government. We had the establishment of the electoral justice to supervise, to monitor, the elections, so as to make sure that no corruption, would take place again. And we also have the labor justice, right, to monitor the companies, the entrepreneurs, and make sure that the labor laws would be fulfilled, right, would be met. And finally, we have this compulsory and public primary education. This is something also that was quite a breakthrough, because until this time, education was a privilege of those that could pay for it. Now, from 1934 onward, the state would have to provide people with at least the primary education. Okay? Well, so Getúlio Dornelas Vargas was indirectly elected as the president, right? And we have to understand what the context at the time was. Because, this constitution of 1934, for example, it was pretty influenced, by the constitution of Italy. So it was pretty much a fascist constitution, right? And the context, the worldwide context was basically very polarized, right? Ideologically saying, the world was really polarized. Nowadays, we used to say that, especially in Brazil, in my opinion, we used to say that we've never seen such a polarization like that in terms of politics and also in terms of many other topics. But at the time, it was amazing how polarized the world was. We basically had communists and socialists, right, which represented the left party, right, the left. So, they were there in Russia, right, and on the other hand, we had, the extreme right, fascism and Nazism, right? Not only fascism and Nazism, but we had Francoism, Salazarism in Portugal, right? So we had this totalitarianism. Sorry, we had this totalitarianism going on. Both on the left side and on the right side, right? And on the right side, these totalitarian leaders such as Hitler and as I said, Salazar, for example, in Portugal, and Mussolini in Italy, they were supported by the bourgeoisie, right? Because this bourgeoisie was afraid that, the communists could come and enter into their countries and establish communism in their countries, right? So in order for that not to happen, they really supported these totalitarian leaders, right? And so we have totalitarianism, and these totalitarian leaders, they really implemented liberal democracy, right? You see that very clearly in Germany, for example, because Hitler, although he was totalitarian, he was really, really capitalist in terms of the way that he implemented things in Germany to make it a superpower at the time, right? And we have this totalitarianism, supported by this strong and really extreme capitalists in their own countries, and that automatically meant, the fall of liberal democracy in the world, right? And Brazil was influenced by that, right? So as I said, Vargas was indirectly elected as president by the Congress, right? And in Brazil, we had this clear polarization as well. We had the ANL, the National Liberating Alliance, whose leader was Luiz Carlos Prestes, right? He was a a guy, a folk that really had left-wing lieutenants, socialists, communists, and his students by his side, on his side, right? And really, the objectives of the ANL were the payment of external debt. I mean, no more payments. Yeah, they should stop paying the external debt immediately. That's one of the things they claimed, right? The other thing they aimed at was a nationalization of companies, agrarian reform, people's government, and an alliance with the USSR. Yeah, they were really, really extreme, right? And this is Prestes, right? And, well, on the other side, on the other pole, we had AIB, the Brazilian Integralist Action. Why integralist? Well, because, on the totally opposite direction of the other party, they did not want the fight of classes, as we see in communism and socialism, right? No, integralism was pretty much about each class integrating for the good of the state, And the leader of this party in Brazil was Plínio Salgado. He was supported by the church and the sectors of the armed forces, right? Why the church? Yeah, because at the time, they use as their motto, this thing that the communists, they would destroy the church, they would eat the children and all that stuff. That was really insane. But anyway, they were really fascist, right? And so they had this nationalism, this exacerbated nationalism, and really they supported this worship of the leader's personality, just like you saw in Italy and in Germany and in Spain with General Franco and in Portugal with Salazar, right? The objectives were also clear. A single party, so no more many parties, right? No, just one party, the AIB, a totalitarian state, but with a really capitalist, with a very radical capitalist initiative, right? And a dictatorial government. Okay, well, this is Plínio Salgado. Here you see on his uniform, you see the symbol, this mathematic symbol that is the sum, right? That represents the integralist concept that I told you about. Okay, well, the constitutional government. Okay, so the whole thing began. The whole thing began kind of troubled, right? We had in 1935 the communist intent. Okay, Prestes, made this speech against Vargas in Rio de Janeiro, and Vargas didn't really like it, so he ended up closing ANL, right? But even so, ANL had this, this strong objective of dominating the country. So they came up with a plan. They would start this revolution in the state of Natal, in Recife, and in Rio de Janeiro, right? And it would be strategically implemented, right? In a sequence starting in Natal, Recife, and Rio de Janeiro, but it didn't work out. It was not really synchronized as they expected to be, right? So it started in Natal, it went to Recife, but before coming to Rio de Janeiro, the government was aware of what they were doing, and yeah, the government actually won the battle. Prestes is arrested for 10 years, right? His wife, Olga, that was from Germany. She was German, but she was actually a Jew. She was sent back to Germany, and that was really cruel, right? Because she ended up being murdered in the gas chambers in Germany, right? And well, as you can probably imagine, that was pretty strong. That was pretty impressive, for a beginning of mandate of term. So Getulio Vargas declares state of siege in the country. Okay. Well, the thing is that after the communist intent, we would have the first direct presidential, the first direct election campaign for president, right, in 1938. However, the government came up with this amazing news that basically stated that there was a communist threat in the country, and it was called at the time the Cohen Plan, right? They would attack the authorities, the churches. They would really make a mess out of the country, right? And well, on November 10th, 1937, we had the coup, the state coup by Getulio Vargas. He claimed that it was not safe at the time, to proceed with the elections for president, and that the country, in order to to defeat the communism that was kind of wanting to to take over the country. In order to destroy this communism, the country needed a strong government, right? And that's basically what happened. We had the coup, and here you have the newspaper at the time, Getulio Vargas addressing the nation, right? And explaining why, these radical measures were taken by the government, right? As you read here, the National Congress was dissolved. The governors of Pernambuco and Bahia had resigned. There would be a new constitution, right? And then you have all the information here. And basically a dictatorship was established in the country, under the premise, under the assumption that it was necessary at the time. But later on, we found out that there was no such communist threat going on, and that it had all been designed, brilliantly designed by Getulio Vargas, right? Well, with that, we had the beginning of what we call in Brazil the new state, right? The new state was the new government, the new dictatorial government of Getulio Vargas that lasted from 1937 to 1945, right? So as Getulio Vargas had said, we had a new constitution drawn up, right? It was nicknamed the Polish Constitution here in Brazil, and it was more than ever based on fascism and Nazism, right? It was not, it was simply bestowed, right? It was 100% nationalist and centralist, so all power was given to the executive power, right? We had the extinction of the political parties, and now we would no longer have, a democracy. We would have decrees law. In this period, there was a lot of censorship, torture, and death penalty, right? And we had, as a consequence, we had the nationalization of mineral resources and energy resources. We also had the implementation of DASP, the Public Service Administrative Department, and it aimed to rationalize and modernize public administration through public tenders. Also, it was used to supervise the interveners, right? And it created a bureaucracy, right? We had the beginning of something really sad that started in Brazil, that was the employment favoritism. That guy that is like referred and stays there forever, right? Well, we also had in the economy sphere, we have this economic nationalism going on. We had the National Coffee Council. Yeah, coffee was still pretty much, the flagship in the country. But, during this period, Getúlio Vargas is going to invest a lot in the industry, right? This is really, the late industrialization of Brazil, right? And really, we have to say that Getúlio Dornelas Vargas was responsible for that. We had the creation of the National Petroleum Council. We had the establishment of the minimum wage. Yeah, so more than in the two previous occasions, Getúlio Vargas is going to invest in terms of labor regulations and laws, right? So he creates the CLT, the Consolidation of the Labor Laws that had been previously created. So, as I told you, the industrialization in the country was something that was really, implemented by the government during this new state period. We had the World War II going on, yes. And so Brazil began to export raw materials, especially rubber, right? And well, since you're investing in your industry, obviously you're going to need what? You're going to need raw materials, right? So we had the creation of the National Steel Company, and in Volta Redonda, right? Basically, we had this company that would feed the growing industry in the country, right? We had the Vale do Rio Doce Company that would basically provide all the resources to CSN. We had lots of state investments, and in order for these state investments to happen, we need, Getúlio Vargas would resort to loans, right? Actually, Getúlio Vargas played a double game here. We had the World War II going on, and Getúlio Vargas was pretty much, like Hitler and Mussolini here in Brazil, right? So he would interact with Germany and with Italy and Japan, okay? But on the other hand, he would also interact with the United States. And he would, let's say, pick the one that was more profitable, right? And, well, in this case, it was the US, right? We were offered a $45 million loan, to invest in the Vale do Rio Doce company and basically in the industrialization of the country, right? And so, as a response, to this partnership with the USA, we joined them, in their. This is Getúlio Vargas again in his speeches. We joined USA in World War II. Right, we became the USA's ally, right? Ally, sorry. We became the USA's ally, right, in the Second World War, and really, that ended up being a problem for Getúlio Vargas, right? Why? Here you have a picture of the Brazilian soldiers sent to the Second World War, right? In Brazil, they are called pracinhas, right? And this icon, this flag you see here is a snake smoking a pipe, right? And it is curious because it is derived from an expression that we have here in Brazil in Portuguese that they would say that the soldiers would only be sent, that it was easier for a snake to smoke a pipe than the soldiers in Brazil to go to Italy and to Germany to fight against these, fascist countries, just like Brazil was fascist at the time. And yes, it ended up happening. So they put that, on their uniforms. So in 1942, Brazil declares war on Germany, on Japan, and Italy, right? We also helped the USA with military bases for them in Brazil, in the cities of Recife, Natal, Salvador, and Belém, right? We provided them food and raw materials, right? And we sent troops through the FAB, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, and through FAB, the Brazilian Air Force. Okay? Well, but as I told you, that ended up becoming a problem to Getúlio Vargas. Why? Because it didn't take long for Brazilian thinkers, for Brazilian scholars to realize that the guy who was sending soldiers to fight Germany and Italy actually agreed with them and actually made use of the same political system that they made use of. So we had, in 1943, the Minas Gerais Civilians Manifesto. We then had, in 1945, the first Brazilian Writers' Congress. So Getúlio Vargas was under a lot of pressure, right? And that became even worse once, Hitler and Mussolini were defeated in Europe, right? So we had the victory of the Allied democracies. And so there was really no ideological basis for the new state to keep existing, right? After all, Nazism and fascism were history. So they were like, so what now? What are you going to do, Getúlio? What do you have to tell us about it? And, well, really, at first, he granted amnesty for the political prisoners. So he released from prison Luis Prestes, for example, in 1945. And he announced direct elections for president. He also allowed the existence of other political parties such as UDN, the National Democratic Union, PSD, the Social Democratic Party, the PTB, Brazilian Labor Party, and PCB, Brazilian Communist Party, even the Brazilian Communist Party. Yeah, so he was really doing his best, to stay in power. And, well, on the other hand, there were people that were happy with the Getúlio. Here on their signs, we read, "We want Getúlio because he gave us retirement rights. We want Getúlio. Getúlio, the candidate of the proletariat." That's what the signs say. This was called in Brazil queremismo, right? It can be translated at the, the remaining movement, right? This is a good translation for that. Well, so basically, these guys, they advocated the call of a national constituent assembly under the leadership of Vargas, right? And these movements, actually, what we figure out about then is that they were organized by PTB, that had everything to do with Getúlio Vargas, right? And they were supported by PCB. But that was not enough. On October 29th, 1945, Getúlio Vargas leaves the presidency, right? And a little before that, there was a fear in the country that he was planning on a new coup, right? Because he had appointed his brother, Benjamin Vargas, to police chief of the federal district. And, well, they were like, oh, his brother has been appointed. There are guys saying that they want him to be ahead of the National Constituent Assembly. Yes, he did that in the past. He can do it now. So, yeah, so that was the end of Vargas. He was put out of power. José Linhares, president of the Federal Supreme Court, assumed provisionally, the executive power. We had presidential elections in December 1945, and we had President Eurico Gaspar Dutra elected, and he had actually been supported by Getúlio Vargas. You see how powerful the guy was. He was even able to put in the presidency, in the executive power, the man that he was supporting, right? Well, so here you have a picture of both of them, Getúlio Vargas on your left and Eurico Gaspar Dutra on your right. Okay? Well, so this is all for now. I hope you have enjoyed it. This is really, really an important part of the Brazilian history that, as I said in the beginning, was a turning point in the Brazilian history. And in our next video, we will talk about the Dutra government. Okay? Thank you very much and see you soon.